Even if you're not a fan of tennis, you will know obviously who Novak Djokovic is and maybe even have an opinion on him. And as he comes to the end of his career, he's 38 years old now and visibly slowing down, but still very elite. It's clear to anyone who follows tennis that he is one of, if not the best player of all time. Yet still, he's curiously really hated by almost everyone I know. I can't think of anyone in my friendship group who is their favorite player, which is odd in itself. But even odder than that, I feel like almost everybody I know is distinctly cold on him and he's hated. So I want to explore a bit of that today because success is interesting, and the types of people and the personalities that you have to achieve certain kinds of success are also super interesting to me. But fundamentally, I just want to explore it because coming out of the closet here, I'm a big Djokovic fan. I love watching him. I love watching his interviews. I think it's amazing what he's achieved in the sport. I find his backstory fascinating and how he's gone about it to be super impressive. And I feel like I feel like that's kind of akin to, being a member of the Nazi party or something like that. It's just something that always seems to meet resistance when I bring it up or talk about it. So I want to deconstruct a bit of it here in the podcast today. And I'm not going to be looking too much at sports stats or the history of particular matches or turning points or things like that, though that is very interesting to me. I know that this is not a sports podcast. It's not my area of expertise to be commenting on that stuff anyway. I'm instead interested in what's the social reaction to kind of success and public figures and how they go about what it is that they do and how we see that. And yeah, I just want to scratch at the surface a bit and find out a bit more about what might be happening there. So no matter who you are, I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for joining me. As someone who's spent a lot of time on microphones in front of crowds, trying to be funny and get good reactions and whatever else, I've always found post-match tennis interviews to be really funny because there's something about that environment where the crowd just wants you to do well, where they want to hear certain things and it's very low-hanging fruit, but also a narrow path. It's kind of like wedding speeches in a way, which is like a common thing to see is you watch a best man or a maid of honor give a speech and everybody laughs so much. And then afterwards, everybody goes up to them and says, "You're so funny and charming. You should do stand up or whatever." But of course, it's like totally different from that environment where everyone wants you to succeed and everyone knows each other. And it's a warm atmosphere. Everyone's drunk as well. And stand up where everyone's drunk, but you can't really let too much blood in the water or everyone will immediately hate you. Maybe that's not fair, but there are obviously differences. And in tennis, it's always been really funny to me to see the athletes that, because they're often 20-year-olds, who English might be their fourth language, and they've just exercised intensely for 2 hours doing something hyper competitive, and they come out and then they get asked, just the most Dorothy Dixon questions like, "How was it today? It looked like you really gave your all, but you also respected the opponent." And they'll say, "Yes, I came and I was so happy to be here and I can't believe I won, but sorry I beat you, but that's how it goes. Maybe next time it will be you standing here." And then everybody just like, "Oh God, it's so good. We love it. Oh my God." I love that stuff. It's so funny because it's so ridiculous. I kind of should make a compilation of it. Or maybe I'll do it for the patrons of ridiculous tennis interviews and how warm the crowd is. And in that environment, I've been following tennis for all my life, really, but particularly as an adult for the last 20 years, which has been the period in which Federer and Nadal and Djokovic have dominated. And now at the tail end of Djokovic's career, you've got Alcaraz and Sinner in there. And in that whole time, Djokovic across it all has been the most dominant player by kind of any metric. But yeah, as I said at the top, he's no one's favorite player and everyone seems to hate him. And I've written down a list of reasons why I think that might be. They're just theories, who knows? It's a dynamic of things that I think has really held him back from being loved by people. And in the same way with those tennis interviews where they're walking that narrow path where it's clear what they've got to say to be really extremely beloved easily, I think you step outside that path just a little bit and it falls away completely and you're hated. And I think that's a big part of what Djokovic has been for people because he's not the archetypal tennis playing the role of like a nice boy that's a good sport and overwhelmingly humble and all these other things that I think are largely performative which is not to say that the people that exercise that do those performances aren't also those things, but I don't think that Djokovic isn't also those things. I just think there are some players that don't play that game and they really get punished in that realm. And Kyrgios was one of them as well. But I mean, he's a totally different character as well. I won't talk about him today. But yeah, there's a few, and they seem to be like kind of more the Aspie types that play that game less and really suffer for it, really get punished and don't seem to understand what's happening because they're not as motivated by the social game or whatever. Anyway, so the first and I think most obvious reason that Djokovic is hated is because he came onto the scene where there was this great dynamic between the two best players of all time, Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, and they were trading slams and they were both neck and neck at the top of the game. Roger was unbeatable on grass, Rafa was unbeatable on clay, and there's a third guy who's a couple years younger now who starts to chip away at their heels and to take titles from them and also to rob us from Federer Nadal finals and things like that. Nadal and Federer have a kind of characterized gentlemanly rivalry, which was a difficult narrative to square with Djokovic, who's not the same type of personality in how he goes about speaking to the media or behaving on court and what have you. And I think that if those two weren't there in this dynamic, then I think Djokovic would have just come up and been an extremely successful tennis player and people would have taken that. But that it came squarely against this very romantic center stage dominance of a type of not narrativized, but also real dynamic rivalry between Federer and Nadal. I think people understandably were like angry and reacting against that. And like, this is not what tennis is about. This other guy, he's a flog, he's a tosser, he's a whatever. And Djokovic obviously felt that really strongly because I think it must be really alienating. You see it happen in lots of sports where people get really successful and then aren't loved for it and they're hated for it. And they're like, what? But I just did all the things that I thought everyone would really like me for. All I am doing is being successful and trying, and you still don't like me. And then you kind of become the heel and the villain and react against that. Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of what's at play and why people don't like Djokovic. Plus, so fair game. I was absolutely one of those people at the start of it all. I didn't like him there. I thought he was, I'm kind of embarrassed to say it which is so stupid because I mean, I'm such a big advocate of changing your mind on things. And also, why does it matter that you hold the same opinion on, anyway, whatever. As embarrassed as I am to say it, I was in the haters camp. I thought this guy sucks. He doesn't have any of the class of Federer and Nadal or whatever. And then as the years went on, I just kept watching him and seeing in the interviews how he conducted himself and realized that, he's actually just representing himself and who he is. It's not that he has a hateful mentality, or it's not that he's trying to do anything that the other greats of the sport aren't. And in that, where I talk about the game of how you navigate the press interviews and what you say about your opponents and how you behave on court, etc., I actually have come over time to admire him more than the others because he does take a huge cost for, rather than playing that saccharine, full respect, everybody, I had such a great time. This is my favorite crowd, whatever. He just does play it with a straight bat and say exactly what he thinks and wears a lot of consequences for that. And strangely, this really played out in the COVID years where very famously he didn't get the vaccination. And so he wasn't able to enter Australia and was in fact arrested, imprisoned and then deported. That period led to a lot of people really hating him. And myself, even though I'm a vaccine advocate, I've found that was maybe the main turning point for me in how I thought about him. Not because I admire people for not getting vaccinated, but I thought that the way in which he was treated was insanely outlier, cruel. I mean, he's being deported from a country in which the population of 10 to 20% or something of people aren't vaccinated anyway. And just being singled out, despite having been given the indication that he would be allowed to go in. And then, harsher things happen to people, and harsher things happen from the Australian government's immigration systems to people, of course, every day. But that he endured that process without jumping onto the pulpit and saying, I'm being hugely prosecuted or whatever. But he also wasn't saying that people shouldn't get vaccinated and it's really bad and it's going to kill you. He just said, I'm an athlete, I make my own choices about my body and I don't want to do this. And yeah, he was extraordinarily punished for it. And I think given we live in a world now where the coronavirus is endemic and we don't require vaccination certificates for people to be valid in society, I think he's really vindicated because it's just a question of timing. He wasn't okay to do that then. Now, say if the government said you need a flu vaccination to play tennis, I think people would see that as a bit odd. And yeah, obviously Australia was a particularly outlier political entity in how it responded to the virus, and also an outlier society in how people like to interrelate with rules and the kind of appetite we have for co-enforcing them. So I think that was maybe the definitive turning point where if people didn't know about and dislike Djokovic already, then that puts him squarely on the side of really not liking him because he was breaking our rules, and that marked him as an outlier. Plus, there's that general tall poppy flavor in Australia, where success is frowned upon, or at least not respected on its own as a metric in and of itself. But I don't think you can chalk up the hatred of Djokovic to that, because obviously people love Federer and Nadal, and there's a huge history of revering sporting legends. Yeah, so I don't think it is just that. But there's something there also in being the combo of being an outsider and then going on and dominating the sport that makes it even more distasteful. And it's so funny, even like now you go and see the comments under any sort of post or article about Djokovic, and so many of them are just undermining the nature of whatever his achievement is. Just to give an example, people will go in and say, oh yes, but he got to dominate easy years when Federer was almost retired, or he cheats in certain ways, or whatever it might be. It's kind of graceless, and not surprising because you probably see the same under LeBron or Tom Brady or any other sort of, greatest athletes. People like to sit on their couch and think that by dismissing the greatness of others, that somehow makes them great, or at least marginally better. But I think that all this stuff, it kind of takes away from what the best opportunity is of celebrating greatness, which is understanding why it is that this guy, who's come from a war zone in a poor country to dominate a sport that's historically only even accessed mostly by people with privileged backgrounds, because it takes a pretty significant financial investment to get to the top level, not just for all the time it takes for access to materials and spaces to train as a junior, but then as you do start to go up in the levels, but still before fully professional ranks, it's very expensive to travel around and all the gear that you need, et cetera, et cetera. So, this guy has come from a distinct disadvantage. When he's playing as a 10-year-old or whatever, they're having to move courts every day because Belgrade is being bombed. And the coach would move around reasoning that the Americans wouldn't bomb the same place 2 days in a row. So that stuff, all feeds into reasons why you would not be successful. But of course, for him, and there are countless of other examples in other fields, it obviously is the thing that spurs you on, being such a far outsider, and then, getting a chance and wanting to take it, and understanding the value of the opportunities that you have, and having a clear vision of what that goal is that's very far from whatever the hardship that you're experiencing or experienced in the past. And I think that's super interesting and charming. There's a wonderful story of the woman who discovered him, Jelena Gencic, a Serbian athlete herself, who saw him and immediately saw his potential and said to his parents, because his parents ran a pizza shop or something across the road from a tennis court, and he was super interested. There's a video of him, old VHS of him as a 3-year-old getting, I think, a clarinet or something for his birthday and being really sad. But then he gets the actual gift, which was a tennis racket, and he's just delighted because it was all he wanted. And she said they said to her, look, we don't have much money, and should we focus on this? Is it a real chance? And she said, yeah, he's going to be number one. And she had a super interesting story herself. I hope somebody does a good film or documentary of her. So she was a tennis and a handball player, and she played a big role in the development of so many top players from that part of the world. So she not only coached a lot of top players, but she also discovered them. She picked up Djokovic, Monica Seles, Goran Ivanisevic, among others. And of the crew that she coached, they won something like 35 or even more singles titles, which is just unimaginable as a record. And you can see interviews of Djokovic talking about her. She unfortunately died maybe 10 years ago, and so hasn't gotten to see the full extent of his success, but he was still very successful, of course. And he speaks so warmly of her. He calls her his tennis mother. And she introduced him not only to to sports coaching and strategy and technique and whatever, but also to poetry and to meditation and to classical music. And it sounds like a really special relationship that they had. It's the type of thing, I mean, it's in my wheelhouse of interest anyway, but I would love to just watch a 20-hour documentary of him talking about her and all the people that knew her, talking about the work that she did to develop these stars, because it's such a dynamic. It's one thing to be able to spot talent, but another to nurture it, and then a third thing to create the space in front of people where they can become these legends of the sport that those players did. So after personally having the turning point of seeing Djokovic as, the villain who was taking away from Federer and Nadal to someone who was successful in their own right to then sympathizing for him, I now, whenever I get to see his interviews, I'm only interested in seeing whatever he's doing as proof of whatever it is for a person like that to be the best in the world. Because I know it's close to look at like how many slams people have won or that type of thing. Because, he's only a couple ahead of Nadal and Federer. But in terms of total dominance of the game, he's actually significantly ahead. And to do things like I think he was 36 or something when he won the gold medal at the last Olympics in Paris against Alcaraz on clay. Kind of hard to conceive in advance that he could do this stuff, but he just keeps doing it again and again. And there's a kind of mental fortitude or belief and creation and intersection with reality that you have to have that has this space for achievement that nobody else is able to access. And I find that fascinating, especially because, people aren't interchangeable. Like I couldn't do whatever he's doing. I mean, I shouldn't pick myself because that's like, I couldn't be 50,000th in the world if I'd only played tennis all day, every day. You couldn't take the person who's currently number 2 in the world and make them into Djokovic by giving them exactly the same program and exactly the same mentality. Everyone is different, and there's an interaction with who you are and what your experience is and how you respond to things that frame what, good coaching is going to be for that particular athlete. But I talked about in the success episode how Djokovic has an extreme discipline and focus on what it is that he's doing, to the degree that after he won, I think it was the Australian Open, all he wanted was to have a piece of chocolate. So he sent his son or something to get him a square and put it on his tongue and let it dissolve, and then thought, good, all right, that's enough. He didn't want to take away from his focus on winning the next Grand Slam. And that, you can kind of imagine what it would be to have that kind of discipline and focus across every element in your life. I mean, maybe you can. I actually can't, to be honest. It's so alien, but admirable. And so then, if I'm watching an interview with him and then he says in the post-match, I was a bit sore and I didn't win today because, a number of factors, but, the soreness stopped me from winning. I probably would have won otherwise. A lot of people see that type of thing and like, oh, you arrogant and you selfish and you graceless and whatever. But for me, I just see it as interesting because, yeah, okay, somebody, like if it was me up there giving excuses about my hamstrings, then yeah, it's probably something else at play. It's not like I was going to win the championship. But him, he's played through some astonishing injuries. Like he played through, I think, a 6-centimeter tear in his hamstring to win the Australian Open, which was the year after he was banned or something. And so if he's saying this stuff, like, I give it a different due and find it really interesting. But I find it really interesting how much he's hated for speaking the truth. Actually, Patrick Dangerfield is another one who I love, it's the same. He's in this Australian football context where, he'll say something like, I'm pretty good at football. And everyone will be like, you arrogant, you're up your own butt. And he's like all the evidence is there that he is pretty good at football. He's not just pretty good, he's extraordinary, but there's no room culturally for that kind of acknowledgement. And tennis is kind of that same environment where there's so much of the sort of, quote unquote gentlemanly visage to keep up, where you have to play a certain social game to be considered acceptable. But at the end of the day, these are all ruthless psychos that are like, they're gearing every element of their own life to just be an athlete that in a highly psychologically and physically intense game to beat other people. Of course, these people are going to be competitive. Of course, they're trying to win and they want to win. And acknowledging that is somehow a faux pas. It's really something else. And this sort of stepping outside the rules of what's expected is still like punishing him at the tail end of his career. I saw this week there was an article in The Guardian where the headline was, "Stop being such a jerk, says Djokovic," or something like that. And I looked at it, I was like, oh, is he telling a player to stop being such a jerk? And then you read through, and I went and watched the press interview that he was doing it from. He was asked, what would your message be to your younger self? He's like, oh, I don't know, just relax a bit, stop being such a jerk. Like, it's the headline story from watching that exchange was, oh, look at this guy is reflecting and developing as a person and thinks, oh, I didn't need to take it so seriously and have anger about a situation or whatever. It's stop being such a jerk, just relax. But that's not the headline. The headline is stop being such a jerk. Whereas instead it could be, Djokovic reflects on personal development through career or something. But of course, news is trash. Those things are only designed to, obviously, I'm not saying anything new. They're only designed to attract attention and invoke emotional responses. But I feel like he's not really getting the victory lap of love as much as he deserves, particularly given we've just seen Federer and Nadal do their, twilight years to constant love and support. I mean, he's getting more than he was, but nothing commensurate with what he's achieved in the sport or just as a human. And I mentioned last week that I keep turning to tennis as a metaphor for things, and I reflected upon that a bit. It's not just because I follow the sport, but there's something about tennis itself that's such an extreme psychological test and physical. It's like Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, they win. Their winning percentage, I mean, they win basically every game that they play except for against each other. But their winning percentage point to point is like 53%, 54%, 55%. So they basically lose every second point, which just shows how important it is in tennis because of the scoring system to rise to occasions and to respond, without tension and with focus and with clarity and physical expertise in the points that you choose to rise to, where your opponent is trying to do exactly the same thing. So it's an extremely intense thing. It really attracts and rewards and sifts out a type of development for people and athletes that other sports don't really demand of you in the same way. There are very few places to hide. And I think, that's why we watch someone like Kyrgios and it's so compelling because, this guy is clearly so good and is not able to take the final step of applying how good he is in a consistent way. And, McEnroe was the same and he still managed to win stuff. But to have, on the other hand, these, Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, who are quite different personalities with very different physical playing styles, to dominate so similarly, I think they have to have in common that extreme psychological fortitude and capacity to keep developing and to pay attention and the capacity to want that as well, which is not everybody has. Yeah, I just find it so compelling, which I think is why I turn to it as a metaphor so often, because it's a hyper stylized example of so many things that we can find in our own lives if we go looking. So maybe the final thing I wanted to talk about in this is that there's a cognitive bias that you should all be on the watch out for in yourself and in others, called the halo effect, which you may know, which is where if you see a positive trait in someone or something, then you tend to attribute other positive traits to that entity. So for example, if you see someone's attractive, you might then think, oh, they're also very intelligent. Or if you think back to school, think in your class who were the best behaved kids, you might also think that they were the best students or most intelligent, when there's absolutely no reason that is necessarily the case. But it's just a classic cognitive bias. And on the other hand, I've always called it the reverse halo effect, but I just looked it up. It has a name, the horn effect, which is once you attribute a negative trait to somebody, then everything they do is seen through that lens. And I see that happen again and again with Djokovic, which is, just today he won a match because he had an injured opponent. And in his interview, he said, look, I feel really bad for him because I was on my way home. It looked like he was going to win this match. And I checked the comments before coming here to record this, and people underneath are like, oh yeah, words are cheap or whatever. Whereas I could just imagine if Federer said the same thing, it would be genuine class. Oh my God, this is the best human of all time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's sportsmanship. And that reverse halo effect is just clearly haunts Djokovic the whole time, really. I guess, that initial negative reaction because he's on the scene, being gangly and an outsider and a direct speaker and, brash in a world of Federer and Nadal. But is Nadal not brash? I've seen Federer say plenty of very graceless things in post-match interviews. They're all, as I said, they're all athletes gearing their whole life around themselves, trying to do a psychotically competitive activity. Of course, they're going to be a little huffy and a little protective and defensive and whatever else. It's mad of us to expect otherwise. Because if you could think of someone who's just going out there just to enjoy it and just to be nice to everybody else, I tell you what, they're not winning. You have to really try. It's a very competitive world. And yes, so that reverse halo effect is something that you really see happen everywhere with Djokovic. What happened last year at the Australian Open? Tony Jones, the Australian journalist and sports commentator, he was manning the desk at the Australian Open, and there were a bunch of Djokovic fans cheering behind him for Djokovic, and he turned around and was like, he's overrated, he's no good, or whatever. And it's just unimaginable that anyone would do that around, well, kind of any other athlete, really, but certainly not around anyone who is so successful. Yeah, it's crazy. But there you go. And then I should say that the negative things that you hear just go on to reinforce themselves. Then when Djokovic is told by the tournament director that he can participate in the Australian Open in 2021 and he comes and is then deported, it's, we already don't like him a little bit. So it's like, oh, this is the villainous guy who doesn't respect the health of others. It's not like, oh, this is the guy who's made a particular choice for his own beliefs, which happen to be different to mine. I'm glad that he's now spending time detained and that he's going to get kicked out of the country when, all he's trying to do is play a couple games of tennis, which is especially funny because there were probably vaccinated people who were bringing COVID in that period. Not funny. It was a dire time, but funny in the sense of thinking we control things with our rules, whereas reality is playing a different game. Yeah, so actually, sorry, I said that was my final thing, but I should say a bit more about why I love Djokovic. I love tennis players that are successful across the board. I love Nadal. I love Federer. I love watching Alcaraz and Sinner. Medvedev's my absolute favorite of all time. He's not that successful, which is the other element of what I love that ties into Djokovic, which is they're players that just say what they want and do what they please and are as they are. And the fact that they pay a cost for that is something that makes me like it even more, because it's in a realm where there's every reward to be had for being a little bit fake and hiding the ugliness of human desire and competitiveness and overplaying humility and Zen detachment. And I think in those worlds, these are traits of things that Djokovic legitimately does have. He does caring for others through the work that he does. Like if you listen to any of the other players on tour talk about him, they'll say how incredibly supportive he's been of them despite being competitors in terms of giving advice and helping them through tough times. So that's players across the board, men and women. And he also has done great work with the players committee, establishing that so that and constantly advocating for players who are just below that financial threshold of viability, some of the wealth that's at the top of tennis being shared further downfield so that there can be more people trying to put their hat in the arena, etc. But that stuff is not really something that he particularly parades around. And then at the same time, where he does say that he's trying to win and how he's going about it, like I find that refreshing and even separate to that, just interesting, because he's done something that nobody else has done. And isn't it fun to get to hear about what are the ingredients for him and how he's gone about that? Yeah. So that's my time in praise of Djokovic. I guess I'm an edgelord, so if everybody turns against Nadal or Federer, I'll do an episode on them, but I can't see that happening in a hurry. Kyrgios, as those who know me well, is an ongoing source of fascination for me. He's still alive and doing things, so always more stuff to follow for him. I tried to write a musical about the Kyrgios family and started doing it and advanced it, but then was knocked back for funding in favor of someone, ironically, who did an 8-part podcast I never heard of again. They got the 50 grand. I try to let Djokovic's model serve me and not be too embittered by that and still just worry about the next competition. But I'll tell you what, it would have been a really good musical. Whatever. The next topic will emerge. The next project will emerge. And in the meantime, I'm really enjoying doing this podcast. So thanks so much for listening. And extra special thanks to you if you are one of my Patreon patrons. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining up this week. You're seen and loved by many, I'm sure, but you can add me to that list. And if you want to join on, there's extra episodes now and then. The other content with my music stuff will be ramping up a bit this year. And I put the polls out for which episode you want to see. This was a heavily voted topic, which is why I did it today. Head on over to patreon.com/Endry and give the page a follow on Instagram at Chris Endry Podcast. Love to see you there. Love to see you anywhere. In the meantime, have a wonderful week and I'll speak to you soon.